Hello, everyone. Welcome to our April AI/ML seminar series. Today, I'm happy to host Dr. Aastha Acharya from the Aviation Systems Division here at NASA Ames Research Center. She'll be discussing uncertainty quantification techniques in regards to machine learning and deep learning. And we'll have questions and answers at the very end. So, Aastha, if you want to go for it, just take it away.
All right, thanks, Ryan. Hi everyone. My name is Aastha Acharya, and as Ryan said, I'm a researcher in the Aviation Systems Division here at NASA Ames Research Center. My work is primarily looking at AI ML models and how we can utilize them for a variety of applications here within the division here. But my background with regards to what I did my PhD in has been in uncertainty quantification and also exploring generative models and kind of combining the two topics here. So today's topic is going to be understanding and leveraging uncertainty quantification in deep learning. I've worked on this topic primarily from the perspective of autonomous agents and their dynamics or time series trajectories. But the methods that I'm going to be talking about here, I think they can be applicable to a number of science as well as astrobiology applications, such as, let's say, if you're doing atmospheric studies or image processing or working with any sort of time series data, the methods that I'm going to be talking about will be applicable there as well. So with that, let's go into looking at the outline of what I'll be talking about. So first, I'll be going into introduction, understanding why we need uncertainty quantification in the first place, and what is uncertainty, and what exactly are we talking about here. So kind of setting the scene for us over here. Then I'll talk about some methods of doing uncertainty quantifications. These are primarily going to focus on deep learning models, pre-generative modeling era, I guess. But I will talk about generative models as well and how they can be used as part of the uncertainty quantification process. I'll go into some applications, and this is going to be, some of the problems that I've worked on with robotic systems. So you'll see a lot of those examples coming up through and through. But I do have some computer vision examples in here as well, which might be relevant to more of the folks here. And some advanced topics. So, what are some things that we should be thinking about? What are some things that people are working on, and what is kind of like the next phase of uncertainty quantification here? And finally, we'll conclude. All right. So first, going into introduction, why uncertainty quantification? So deep learning models are being developed for and deployed in a number of high-stakes settings. So for example, as I mentioned, science, so if we're looking to analyze galaxies or any of the other vectorized data that might be there, deep learning is being used extensively for that. But there's also medical field where we might be looking at images and trying to do medical diagnostics. Deep learning is being used in that area as well. And then self-driving cars. Recently, we've seen a surge of self-driving cars. I mean, here in the Bay Area, we even have self-driving taxis at this point. If you look at what their foundation is and what type of models they're going to be using, they are going to be using deep learning in some way or other, whether it's to do object detection or to do decision making or planning or any sort of problem. So. And these are all very high stakes settings, right? These are all critical settings where we do need to be aware of what type of models we're working with and what those models bring to the table. And that's been one of the issues with deep learning models, is that there is that issue of trust. So we here in aviation, we specifically talk about verification as well as validation and maybe even certification of these systems so that they can be integrated more widely across our systems. But in general, even for simple applications, or there is that notion that these systems or these models are still black boxes. So what do we do about that? Like, we don't know what's going on underneath the hood of these models, and how can we still work in that setting and kind of use it to the maximum benefit for our applications. So what that ultimately means is that, yes, there are techniques out there that's looking at the models and looking at their explainability, their interpretability, and all of those things. But what we also ultimately need to know is we need to know what the model doesn't know. So we need to know the limitations of the models and how we should be working with those limitations and in order to make them useful for our application. And this is where uncertainty quantification comes into play. So uncertainty quantification provides a measure of confidence in model outputs, which means that it now enables us to interpret the predictions that are coming out of the model. So instead of just saying, okay, this model is just giving me this final output, I don't know how it got there. We can now look at that, at those outputs and, kind of more intelligently know what's going on there. It can also mitigate risk. So as I mentioned, it's being deployed into a number of high stakes settings, which, we don't want to introduce any new risks into those already risky scenarios. So, how do we manage that? And that's where uncertainty quantification comes into play. And ultimately, it allows us to improve decision making under uncertainty. We know uncertainty is all around us. We know it's there. So, how can we improve our decision making in that scenario? All right, so let's look at deep learning models and what the sources of uncertainty there are. So for a typical deep learning model, now this is a very basic diagram. I'll later on in my slides I'll put some mathematical terminology around this so that we're better exploring this problem. But ultimately, what we have is a data collection and a neural network, right? So this data collection that can consist of any modes of data that may be useful to us. So we can talk about images or text or vectorized data or data in any other form. And we're using a neural network to learn from this data. So we're essentially trying to learn the patterns and trends from the data with some objective in mind. So whether it's to make prediction, whether it's to perform classification, do forecasting, or any number of applications, we have some the model that we're trying to learn from that's learning from the data with some objective. And the sources of uncertainty here are both of these. So the data can bring some uncertainty. So if we are talking about, data that's collected using some type of sensors or that's being measured, that's immediately going to introduce noise into the data. So if it's a faulty sensor, for example, that can introduce noise. If there's this random environmental randomness, which does happen, our environment itself is very noisy, that can also introduce noise and uncertainty into the data. And then any other source of noise that we can think of. I purposely kept this vague because it can be any number of things, which ultimately leads to our data being noisy or uncertain in some way. But at the same time, we also have the model that we're working with, right? So the model is impacted by our architecture choice. So what does the model look like? The hyperparameters choice, and any number of choices that we make as part of the modeling process. And as part of the testing process as well. So both of these can contribute to uncertainties in deep learning. To put that more formally, we're looking at two sources or categories of uncertainty that impacts a deep learning system. And these are aleatoric as well as epistemic uncertainty. And to better understand this, let's look at a simple regression example where, we may have these observations or points, which are the x's here, that is resulting from some true function, the black sine curve here. And what we're trying to do is, without having knowledge of this true function, we're trying to fit a curve through the points here, right? So that's a very simple regression example, but that's also a good example of, the uncertainties that we're likely to encounter. So first, looking at aleatoric uncertainty, this results from the data and is actually an irreducible form of uncertainty. So as I was mentioning before, any of the factors, such as if we have faulty sensors or process or measurement noise, that will come across as aleatoric uncertainty, which means that the points that we're getting or the observations that we're getting are very noisy. It's also due to any intrinsic randomness, so any other type of randomness in the environment that exists. And then there might be cases where we're not capturing the full data for our ultimate objective, right? So we would call this like unobserved or partially observed features, features that we're not capturing but that would ultimately impact the output that we want to see. So if that's not captured, that's creating noise in the data, and that's something that comes across as aleatoric uncertainty as well. On the other hand, we have epistemic uncertainty. So this type of uncertainty results from the model parameter, and it's actually a reducible form of uncertainty. So we can actually go in and take steps in order to reduce this type of uncertainty. And as an example here in this regression, I said that, okay, if we're trying to, use the knowledge that we gathered from all of these points, but rather now trying to fit a curve in the area where we may not have as many data points or where we have insufficient data, then that's giving us epistemic uncertainty. And then if we're also doing out of distribution testing, I know this is a term that many of you have probably heard. It's when we're testing with a distribution that the model hasn't been trained on. That's also going to give us epistemic uncertainty, and also all of the modeling errors that I talked about with regards to, let's say, the architecture choice, the parameters choice, or any number of those things, and any choices we make regarding the models and the resulting errors from that are all going to be epistemic uncertainty. So how do we go about quantifying these two uncertainties? So for aleatoric uncertainty, we place a distribution over the model output, and this is what gives us the aleatoric uncertainty. Whereas with the epistemic, because we're looking more at the model and the choices that we make there, this is quantified by placing a distribution over the model parameters. So we have that kind of clean separation coming out here, where aleatoric is impacted by the data, hence it's a irreducible form of uncertainty, because we may not necessarily be able to do anything about having noisy sensors or the noise in the environment or any of those, and we may not have the ability to kind of go into our data and remove that type of noise to start off with. Whereas epistemic, because it does emerge from many of the choices that we're making with regards to the model, this is a reducible form of uncertainty. So if, let's say, if we don't have sufficient data, we might be able to go and get the data. The data might be noisy, but we can still go and get it. For outer distribution testing, we can shift the distribution so that we're focusing on the distribution that the model has been trained on. And then for modeling errors, again, this is something that we can address as well. So now with this view in mind, I'm going to go into looking at some of the methods of how we may address this. All right, so yeah, talking about the methods, but before we do that, let's look at the neural network model again. So I started off the presentation saying, okay, here's a very broad view of what we're trying to do. We have some data, we're trying to train a neural network. If we look at the neural network and the components there, we have some input that are going into the model. We have the hidden layers where all of the parameters or the weights of the model exist. And then we have finally an output that is coming out. So if we start putting this all mathematically, then first we look at the data, which is the collection of x's and y. So the inputs are the x's here, and the outputs would be the y. And n just signifies the number of samples that we have in the training data. So with the neural network, what we're trying to do is we're trying to predict the output given the input that we have, right? So what we're essentially doing is our prediction would be the y hat here, which is now a function of the x, which is the input. But what we're doing, the weights here are each of the nodes that are in the hidden layer, like how are they contributing to the X factor. So ultimately we're, just multiplying the input times the weight, adding some bias, and then passing it through some nonlinear activation, which is the sigma function here. And we're doing that across each of the different hidden layers. So I have W1 here, which represents the first layer of the network, and then W2 would be the second layer of the network, and so on and so forth. And deep learning, meaning, we have very deep networks, so you can imagine that this chain of operation goes on for a while before we get from the input to the output. But this is ultimately all we're doing. So when we say parameters, we're talking about the weights of the model here. So anything that's not represented by the X here, those are all the parameters that we're talking about, and those are the parameters that makes up the neural network model. So, to kind of put that very briefly, what we're modeling is we're looking at this y hat, which is a prediction, the predicted output, and we're saying that it's a function of the input x as well as the parameters of the model. Now, you may notice that this is for a point estimate here. So we're saying that y hat is one single point that we're going to get as we pass any input through this function, right? So that's the typical view of a neural network is having it as being a single point estimate, like a deterministic predicted output that's coming out. But for uncertainty quantification, we want to move away from this viewpoint and look at it more probabilistically. So this is where Bayesian neural network comes into play. So here's kind of expanding on that equation a little bit. Now we can look at it from more of a Bayesian view. So here's what a Bayesian view of a neural network looks like, where we still have the output, the input. We have the data, but now we're representing it probabilistically. So we're saying what's the probability of y given the input x, as well as the data that the model has been trained with. And in order to look at this probability distribution, we can write it in this full form, which is an integral over the model parameters. And that's essentially what we want to do with the Bayesian neural network is we want to place a distribution over the model parameters so that we can make more so we can ultimately get a probability distribution over the model output as well. So so we still have the X here, which is the model input. We have the predicted model output. We have the model parameters now, and we have this this distribution of how the model parameters is dependent on the overall training data. We can connect that back to Aleatoric and Epistemic really quickly. So you may notice that the colors here kind of match with what we're talking about. So we said that Aleatoric uncertainty emerges from the data. So it's correspond directly to this D, which is the data collection or the total amount of data that we have. And then epistemic uncertainty, since that emerges from the parameters, it's related to the theta, which were the model parameters that we saw on the previous slide with the weights and the bias and the activation function and all of that. So, yeah, this is how we would go about formulating a Bayesian neural network. Now, solving this is another case altogether. So what we want to learn here would be to learn a posterior over the weight. So this component here, this is what we would ultimately like to learn in order to learn this distribution. But that's when the problem arises, right? Because this is intractable. This is not something that we can do easily and that we can solve for. So we actually need to approximate it, and there are a number of methods that exist right now in order to approximate this. And the two that I'm going to be talking about are Monte Carlo dropout as well as ensemble models. The first is Monte Carlo dropout. Dropout, what it means is essentially we're dropping out a subset of neurons. So looking at that neural network model again, and we're canceling out or zeroing out the neurons during the training process. Or it started off as just being in the training process, but as part of uncertainty quantification, we want to do that in the testing time as well. So it's actually started off as a regularization method in order to make sure that any one of the outputs would not be too dependent on any one of the neurons here or any paths, I guess, of the hidden layer. So, in order to regularize that, during the training time, we would randomly sample different neurons to kind of turn off during the process. So that's what dropout started off as. But as there was more research in this, Gall and Garamani they actually found that during dropout during test time would give us a variational approximation to the Bayesian neural network. Because what we're essentially doing is that each forward pass during testing, we're now, that can be seen as sampling from an approximate posterior distribution. So we're saying that by dropping out, random parts of the neurons of the network during testing time, we're getting, let's say, just one approximate posterior. And if we do it repeatedly, then we're getting many posteriors that we can look at for the model. And then if we combine, or if we aggregate all of the outputs, now we can get a predictive mean, which would just be, all of the different outputs from these different models, I guess, or different dropped out variations of the models. And then, so that would give us the mean of the output, and then the predictive variance would just be the variance of the output. So that's one way to, kind of provide us with that distribution over the model output by varying the weights of the model. So this is a very common way in order to do uncertainty quantification using deep learning. And I'll share a paper later on that does this for computer vision, and they have a very cool trick of combining both Aleatoric as well as Epistemic and kind of using this method. So this is the first method. It's pretty simple. It's just one train. You just have to do one training, and you can essentially set a weight in order to say how many nodes you may want to turn off at a time, and what that looks like. And then throughout the training process, like in each epoch, it might just turn off random ones, so that it's creating that distribution of models for you essentially. The next method is ensemble methods. This is probably the one that many folks are familiar with, and what this consists of is training multiple independent models on the same data set and then combining their predictions. So each model is now learning a different function because of the way the parameters are initialized, and also because there may be some data suppling or other things that are going on in the training process. So this also results in different set of model parameters for the model. But with this method, what we're doing is we have the data set. We're still working with the same data set, but now we're training multiple models. So it is more computationally extensive in the sense that instead of training just one model with the dropout method, now we have many number of models. And I'm sure all of you know that with deep learning, this can be quite computationally extensive depending on the size of the model that we're working with. But it does ultimately give us, during test time now, what we do is we run all of the models, and then similarly to before, we aggregate the outputs to, again, estimate the predictive mean, as well as the predictive variance of the output there. We can show this in the regression example that I've been sharing from the beginning. So here, I talked about this example of having, trying to fit a curve through the points of the observations here that's emerging from this true black curve here. And so here I've trained 3 different models on this data. And you can see that in regions where the models kind of agree with regards to their prediction, which would result in, not as much variance, the predictive variance being very low, that would mean that that's a low epistemic uncertainty region. Whereas if we're looking here where we don't have as many samples, and we can see the models kind of diverging in terms of their predictions, that would be indicative of a very high epistemic uncertainty region. So this is one of the simplest ways, I guess, to find that distribution over the model parameters, even though it is more computationally extensive than the previous method, and to get that that uncertainty quantification. Okay, so I think those two are the two of the very popular methods that have been explored and used a lot. I think if you look at a lot of papers trying to do uncertainty quantification, a lot of them will rely on those 2 methods. But recently, with the introduction of generative models, there has been sort of a shift in terms of, how we can now use generative models in order to do uncertainty quantification. So what a generative model is instead of, trying to learn that conditional distribution of P of y given x. So instead of saying, okay, what's the probability of my output given my input now, instead we're just looking at the overall joint distribution of P of x and y together. So this is what gives generative models that generating capabilities, because they are now learning the joint distribution of the overall training data. This means that we can now go and pull samples from it and generate new points, which is what enables all of those new images or new videos or even new text in the case of large language models to emerge. So this has been a very hot topic, but I think we have kind of explored it to see how it can be used for uncertainty as well. And the benefit here is that we're now directly modeling the data distribution, meaning that we're now directly modeling the distribution of aleatoric uncertainty distribution. And this is something that's that is really popular, or I guess nice to have, because we're not necessarily placing a limitation that the distribution has to be Gaussian. So in the previous two cases, you may have noticed that we're looking at the mean of the output and then the variance of the output. So we have no notion of, let's say, if it's bimodal data that's we're actually working with, or any other distribution apart from Gaussian that we may be working with. But with generative model, that kind of opens that field up a lot, because now we don't have to restrict the data distribution to only be a Gaussian distribution. So this is very advantageous in that way. And then two of the methods that have been looked at, and these are methods that I personally have looked at in order to do uncertainty quantification, are variational autoencoder and flow-based models. So here's a diagram just kind of showing you what the two architecture look like. I'm not really going to go into the mathematical details here because I probably don't have the time to do so, but there are plenty of paper out there where you can go and kind of look at this. But with the VAE, what we have is this type of structure where we have the input. It's going through some encoder, and it's being placed into a latent variable, and then this latent variable is then sampled from, and then it's passed through a decoder, and then we have the final reconstructed output, which is this, a reconstruction of the original input here. So this is what gives that generative aspect here. So the benefits with the VAE is that the latent variable here is actually a distribution. So as part of the loss function of a variational autoencoder, what we're doing is we're trying to match this. We're using a KL divergence actually to kind of define this distribution into, it's typically a Gaussian, but it doesn't have to be, into a Gaussian distribution, so that we can then, during the generation time, we can sample from this distribution and get new points of that are similar in distribution to the original training data. So having this Z component that is a distribution within the model itself, that is what enables us to do uncertainty quantification, so that we can, instead of learning or putting a random Gaussian in there, we can actually kind of force it to learn the distribution of the original X model, so that is telling us what the aleatoric uncertainty which would emerge in the data would look like. So that's what a variational autoencoder does. And then we also have normalizing flows, which are exact likelihood models with invertible flows. So here you might notice that yes, instead of like the encoder and decoder for the VAE, now we have what are called flows, which are just functions, but these are invertible functions. So we can get exact inverses of these functions during the training process. And it's very, exact, I guess, in that case. It is also computationally heavy in that you do have to go in and take this Jacobian and all of that. So it's very complex mathematics that are involved underneath, but it does come with that benefit of having those exact likelihood models there. So these two are, pretty popular in sort of getting to the aleatoric uncertainty distribution. So with that, let's go into, looking at some applications and how they have been utilized. So first is within computer vision. I think this is one of the first papers that actually came out on this topic. It's a paper by Kendall and Gall from 2017, and it's titled "What Uncertainties Do We Need in Bayesian Deep Learning for Computer Vision?" This is a really nice paper. So these authors are the same ones who worked on the dropout concept as well. So they were the one who said, doing dropout is actually an approximation to Bayesian methods. So using that formulation and then kind of expanding on the dropout method a little bit. So what they did is they combined the variational dropout, which is, it gives us a distribution over the model parameters, meaning it's primarily giving us epistemic uncertainty, and then combine that with heteroscedastic regression. How can we combine both the aleatoric as well as epistemic uncertainty? So they have nice sections in there in this paper with, a separate section for epistemic uncertainty, a separate section for aleatoric uncertainty, and then the combination of the two about how you might use a loss function in order to capture that. But let's look at this image here where we have some input image, and the objective here is not to do classification, but to do semantic segmentation, which is, I think, easier in terms of, looking at the uncertainties and how the uncertainties come about. So if you look at this input image here, we have some ground truth of the segmentation. You can see the ground truth is pretty clear with regards to, the borders and everything. Whereas now, if you look at the semantic segmentation, you can see that, clearly it's not perfect. So if you look at the crosswalk here, you can see that there's some ambiguity in the model with regards to, what's happening there. I think this person is carrying a backpack in the original and the ground truth, but it doesn't capture that here. There's some fuzziness the farther out back we go. And all of the, the common problems that we might see with the model that's doing the segmentation rather than having the truth label for this, right? So now let's look at what contributes to high aleatoric versus high epistemic here. So high aleatoric here are mostly for object boundaries. Excuse me. Yeah, so as I was saying, high aleatoric is mostly for object boundaries and for objects that are far out from the camera. So if you look at the aleatoric uncertainty case, you can see that it's high, high being the brighter color, exactly around the objects, kind of looking at their boundaries. And then once we go further out, like into the back, like towards the depth, that also contributes to aleatoric uncertainty. And then for epistemic uncertainty, that's more related to visually challenging pixels. So if we look at the crosswalk here, the example that I was just talking about in comparing the ground truth versus the segmentation that the model gives us, and if you look at the input image, you can see that the colors of the road and the sidewalk are actually very similar, and the model, it's going to be pretty hard for the model to distinguish this. So this is why this comes up as epistemic uncertainty here. So yeah, once again, you can see some of the regions where there is a bit of ambiguity in terms of what exactly the pixels might be, like how the colors kind of correspond to different things, and that's what's contributing to the epistemic uncertainty. But yeah, highly, I guess the takeaway here is I highly recommend this paper in order to do this type of analysis for your work as well. Now I'll come to some of my own personal, projects and things that I've done with this. So we've used uncertainty quantification in order to do outcome assessment. So let's say here we have a simple double pendulum system, and where the objective is to get the ball to the target location. I like using this example, even though it's a toy example, because we can clearly see like the trajectories that the model produces and how that kind of shows the uncertainty that exists in the model itself. And then, so what I mean by outcome assessment here is that, let's say for a robotic task, we might be interested in asking, after giving it some text, so let's say the task here was to move the ball to the target location within 20 seconds, we might be interested in learning how the model kind of interprets this, and also what it thinks the outcome is going to be. Like, does it think it's going to reach that outcome before even, starting the process of moving the robot at all? Like, does it think it can get there? What are their chances, and all of that, right? So I hope the video plays. Oops. Okay, that didn't work. I don't know why this video isn't playing. Let me try something. The one, please, but not this one. But maybe I'll show after the fact. But what this could do was that, the robot would be able to say, okay, I'm only 60% confident in reaching the target location. And then it could, kind of forecast out the trajectories using uncertainty quantification methods. And I will say that this was a simulated environment that we created in order to generate the testing data and to put this all the system together, which means that we know that it's a low epistemic or low aleatoric uncertainty problem, meaning that there isn't as much noise in the data. So we were primarily concerned with epistemic uncertainty for this problem. So we were using just deep ensemble models in order to do this, and it was able to create for us trajectories that kind of projected out to the target, whether it's a hit or a miss, and then as the robot went on and kind of did this operation, then it could kind of tell us, how its confidence in reaching the final outcome changed. Hopefully I can show that video later on, but let's move on to look at UAVs and how we may apply the same thing here. So we have some UAV that's taking off and flying. And here what we can do is, let's say we have an operator that's asking the UAV, can the target location be reached in 10 minutes? So this is something that would be asked to the UAV before it even goes about flying. And then the UAV would say, okay, I only will have 80% confidence in reaching the target in 10 minutes. And then as it goes about its flying operation, it can then update this on the fly, and keep communicating that back to the user. So, and this one was actually a high aleatoric uncertainty environment. Even though it was a simulation, still we purposely injected noise into the system in order to test out high aleatoric uncertainty as well. And here we were using generative models in the form of VAEs in order to capture the aleatoric uncertainty. And this comes from one of my papers from 2022. But this goes to show you, the kind of things that we can eventually achieve with uncertainty quantification, and kind of what the downstream application might look like with regards to the model kind of coming back to you and communicating where its limitations might be, or like how it sees the outcome playing out. So with that, I wanted to quickly touch on some advanced topics and so a few things that, or I guess one thing that I particularly have been working on. And this is the entanglement of the uncertainties, right? So far I've talked about uncertainties as being two independent things. I've said, okay, aleatoric uncertainty is coming from the data, it's that one factor, and then epistemic is coming from the model, and it's another factor. Right, so and this is something that I think you'll see across all of the papers on this topic as well, is that they're kind of treated as two separate entities or two independent entities. But this is not necessarily the case, right? Because so we're saying, aleatoric comes from the model output, epistemic comes from the model parameters, but there's a clear dependence of model output on the model parameters, because clearly the parameters that we're working with within the model is going to impact the output that we're going to be seeing, right? So which means that aleatoric uncertainty is naturally intertwined with epistemic uncertainty. And this was personally a huge problem for us because rather than epistemic uncertainty, I think we were primarily concerned about aleatoric uncertainty because we were working with dynamical systems that had a lot of noise in them, right? So it was very essential for us to quantify the aleatoric uncertainty in the most viable and um, not contaminated way, I guess. So how do we kind of separate out the aleatoric uncertainty from the epistemic uncertainty was something that we explored and was very applicable to us for our scenario. So what we did is we kind of laid out this framework and laid out a mathematical formulation and proof in saying that, okay, so what does uncertainty even mean? Like, what are we talking about when we say that we have an uncertain system? What does that contribute to? And what it essentially boils down to is that we have some a true state or true function that we're interested in, and then with the neural network, what we're getting is a predicted function, right? Um, so there is going to be that difference in the true versus the predicted, and that's what uncertainty contributes to. Is that difference between the true and the predicted is uncertainty. And then, given our definition of aleatoric and epistemic, and how we're saying we only have two sources of uncertainty, now we can say that this residual or the difference between the true and predicted is actually going to be a sum of aleatoric as well as epistemic uncertainty. So this now gives us this clean separation where even if there is some kind of cross contamination, I guess, going on, we can kind of force this on the system and say, okay, please just give it to me with like separate terms. And then I won't go into the formulation or the details here too much, but what we showed is that we can use definitions of both epistemic and aleatoric residuals. And then for our case, we were interested in the aleatoric residual, which is derived using a difference between the total minus the epistemic, which just ended up being a difference between y true, which is the true function here, and then ym, which is the prediction, but with the M denoting different ensemble models, because that is essentially, or either ensemble or dropout models, because that is what communicates the epistemic residual here. And I think this image might help with that a little bit. So here's kind of like a framework that we put out there where instead of just looking at the two separately, now we can look at the two together, both the epistemic as well as the aleatoric, and kind of subtract them from each other so that, if we're interested in just getting the residual aleatoric or just the aleatoric quantification, then we can, start from the data collection as we had before. We have the two data points that are coming in, but we're also using that to train an ensemble of models. Hence, this is representing the epistemic and uncertainty part of this. And then what we can do is, sample different models, instead of aggregating them and taking their mean and variance, what if we just sample from them and then use that in order to compute this residual aleatoric, and then train a variational autoencoder, which is, as I mentioned, really good for capturing aleatoric uncertainty, and train a generative model in order to do that. So this is kind of, this just shows you, how we can use different methods for epistemic and aleatoric and kind of combine them together for our purposes and in getting at any one of the uncertainties. Now, there's still a very big open question here is that, and now we're seeing a lot of generative AI models coming out, large language models, VAEs, GANs, and all of those, new models that, have a lot of potential and can be really beneficial to our use cases, but uncertainty quantification for those models is still being worked on. So, what does that even look like when we're talking about expanding UQ methods in those settings and with those models? So that's, I think, one of the big questions that is recently, if you look at research, a recent research, that's going to be one of the topics that is going to be, prime there. But with regards to like your other deep learning models, your CNNs, your RNNs, your any other type of deep learning model that you may be working with, the methods that I've shown so far with the dropout, the Monte Carlo, and even the generative models, they're going to be your key tools in order to do the uncertainty quantification. So yeah, I think we're almost at the end of time here. So I wanted to, quickly summarize what we saw here so far. So uncertainties in deep learning can be classified into two categories. I think this is one of the major takeaways from the talk. We have aleatoric uncertainty, we have epistemic uncertainty. Aleatoric emerges from the data, epistemic from the model. And then we looked at how to quantify the uncertainty. So rather than looking at deep learning as like a deterministic system that gives us a point value for the outputs, what if instead we looked at it probabilistically, right? And that allows us to put the neural network in sort of this Bayesian view, where now we're putting a distribution over the model parameters, and then also looking at the distribution of the final output that's coming in with regards to as conditioned on the input that's going in. So as part of this, in order to approximate it, we looked at Monte Carlo dropout as well as ensemble models, which both gives us numerous posterior distribution over the distribution to sample from. And then we also talked about generative models, which kind of break away from these concepts a little bit, in that it's a very different, but also enables non-Gaussian prediction of aleatoric uncertainty and how that may be used in order to quantify uncertainty. And yeah, I guess the final point is uncertainty quantification is essential in enabling trust in machine learning systems. And ultimately, as I started off at the beginning of the talk, it enables us to improve our decision making under uncertainty and have a better interpretation of what the model is doing with regards to the predictions that is coming out. Yeah, with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I hope I was able to do this topic justice, because there's a lot out there, but this kind of gives you a primer of what we have.
Yeah, Asha, that was amazing. This was extremely helpful. So, also, do you think you can easily find that video real quick, the
Oh,
robot?
yes, thank you for reminding
Because I
me. Let
think that
me
would be really
see.
cool just to see. So
Yes.
while Asha's looking for that, if anyone has questions, you can use the raise hand option right here in Teams, or post a question in chat, and then I'll call on you. Um, okay, go for it, Shirshak.
Hello, I want to ask a question. I think that the BN network has few limitation. Like suppose we have a BN network which would predict the prediction of rains, and it work on the relationship of cloudy sky and another the direction of winds, but a sudden change in the atmospheric pressure and the temperature can affect the clouds and affect the clouds and the rain. So the network might get wrong, and it does not. And even if the cloud is dark, it does not means always that it will be rain. So the in that situation, the BN network might get wrong. So in such cases, what shall we do?
Yeah, so I think you're going into more aleatoric uncertainty. So if you're talking about looking at clouds, looking at all of the other factors that might eventually affect the output. And you're talking about the data that's being fed in to kind of train the model. So with the Bayesian neural networks, so I mentioned that one of the drawbacks was that it kind of places everything in a Gaussian distribution, which, if you're looking at those type of scenarios, maybe you're not capturing the distribution that's actually out there, which is what sounds like what's happening. So I would say, focus on aleatoric uncertainty, first of all, and then second of all, maybe look at some other methods that are out there. With the Bayesian neural networks, I think they're primarily focused on looking at epistemic uncertainty, but you're running into aleatoric uncertainty. So kind of shift your focus a little bit. Maybe look at generative models for doing aleatoric uncertainty quantification. And then once you have a better understanding of, what are the noises and the uncertainty that's coming from the data, I think that will give you a better clue about what would be the best model to use there.
Awesome. Caleb, I see you have your hand raised. Go for it.
Yes, thank you so much. A really, really interesting and useful talk, beautifully presented. So I had a question about ensemble model approaches to uncertainty, and this is a question coming out of complete ignorance. Is it possible to obtain the same kinds of measures of uncertainty instead of training multiple models, train a model and then perturb the weights by an amount consistent with, let's say, the last, modification in its training, and sort of do that randomly again and again to sort of see whether what those perturbations tell you about potential uncertainties, or is that just a stupid thing to do?
No, that's exactly what the dropout model is doing actually, because
Okay.
so instead of, I mean, it would be one thing for us to kind of go in and no matter how randomly, say, like if we have the human factor in there, it's may not be fully random, right? So by enabling that dropout method, which randomly drops out the weights as part of the training process, you're ultimately doing that. You're dropping out the weights. You're kind of um, uh, zeroing out a few nodes here and there. So what you're getting is not just that one model. It may not have the full parameters that we're interested in, because now we are getting nodes that are dropped out. So let's say if you have a model that's like 100 nodes, but you're turning on the dropout for like just 90, so only 90 of the weights are being activated at one time, but it still gives you that variation with regards to the model weights, which ultimately informs the posterior distribution. Which is why dropout is kind of looked at as like an easier way, I guess, not to train multiple models and to just get that.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. I had a question real quick.
Yeah.
Asha. So I guess I had kind of two, and these are very general things. I'm kind of thinking more for users coming into this. One, how obvious would it be to a user that they need to apply uncertainty quantification during their training in the first part? Like, could you actually get through doing something and not even realize that you need to apply it? Or are these techniques kind of more standard practice just while using these different methods?
Yeah, I think the trend right now is the first rather than the latter, even though I would say it's best to use UQ. I mean, we're scientists at heart, right? Like seeing error bars would be ideal in any output that we get, right? But with deep learning models, we're treating them as deterministic systems. We're saying, we're just gonna get this point prediction out and we're gonna trust it and we're gonna go with it. But is that really what science tells you to do? No, we want to, get multiple trials. We want to get those error bars. We want to get those stats on what we're looking at. So that's exactly what UQ enables us to do. So I think, especially if we have systems where, it's not okay to, kind of just ignore those type of things, those type of error bars, those type of distributions. You do need the UQ in there. And I think, going in, and it's I want to say that it's not when you're training or doing your training process, it's not like completely different than how you would go about doing your normal training. I mean, it's just maybe it's a different loss function, or you're just adding a parameter to your loss function, or you're just looking at framing the problem in a different way, right? So it's not like something drastically different that you would have to do. So my suggestion, and this is what I've been pushing for, is just do UQ, or just think about it, how that might look like for your system. Maybe it is complex and maybe there isn't a solution out there, but chances are, I mean, there's been a lot of work in this area, so there might be something for you out there already that you can easily utilize.
Okay.
And I do
Also,
have that video. Oh,
perfect.
I know we have a few more questions.
Yeah, go for it. Actually, do the video and then we'll get Jan.
Okay.
And sorry,
so,
Mark, I also saw that you have a question in the chat, so we'll try to get that. But Jen, 1 second.
Okay, so this is the video. Can you see my screen?
Not yet. We just need to share again. Jen, also, if you run out of time, or if it's getting tight, You can also paste it in there and I'll get it to Aastha.
Okay.
Okay.
Hopefully you can see my screen. Okay, so this is what the video looks like. So here we're giving a task and say, move the ball to the target location within 20 seconds. And I'll just pause it here. So this would be the initial, outcome assessment that comes out even before we deploy the robot here. So it's saying it only has 60%, 66% confidence. And the reason why it may fail is because the ball may go out of reach. And then if you look at the trajectories that it's actually forecasting out, you can see that the green ones are the successful, and then the red ones are, unsuccessful. Maybe it bounces off somewhere and it's not able to reach there. And then it's also able to predict the completion time, and then the strategy as well. It's saying, okay, my best way to complete this is to bounce it off, but it might, kind of go haywire and not reach there. So as it's going through this process, you can see that those values are getting updated. All of this is getting updated, and this is what the final outcome looks like. And I think I have a couple more examples here for different scenarios, but we get the idea. I don't want to take too much time because I know we're at the end here.
That is cool. That is very cool. I may ask you to send me this video later. Yeah, Jan, let's get you real quick. Go for it.
Yeah, my question is, Aisha, if you have limited computing power, but you still want to do alternative quantification, which method is more efficient overall and still give you good enough results?
Yeah, so I guess that also depends on your application, right? So if you're looking at a high epistemic versus low epistemic scenario, ensemble models are going to be computationally expensive, but they're also the simpler way of doing epistemic uncertainty. But again, dropout is there. There is an option for you in order to do that type of quantification. So let's say if you're working with a simulation where you have kind of deterministic data, where you have deterministic data and just wanting to test out the different models, then you're only focused on doing epistemic uncertainty, and you might only focus on looking at either dropout or ensemble models based on the resources you have available, versus if you know that you're not as concerned about epistemic uncertainty and that you really wanted to look at the data and what the noises are coming out of there, then maybe you do want to look at generative models, which may be somewhat more expensive to kind of put together because their architectures are different, but maybe that's the best option for you. So it's not really easy for me to say, okay, so definitely go with this one. I think really depends on your application, depends on the types of uncertainties and noises that you have coming into the system, and of what your overall objectives are.
Thank you so much.
It looks like we have a general question from Mark. It's in the chat. Can you explain the difference between deep learning methods and neuromorphic techniques?
I am not familiar with neuromorphic techniques. I'm sorry, but I can look into it and get back to you.
Yeah, Mark, are you
yeah,
possibly online? Could you give any more little detail on your question?
Yes, I think neuromorphic techniques are those techniques that more closely try to approximate the actual human brain in the learning process.
Interesting.
So I was just wondering, are there any applications really that they have tried as far as like astronomy or anything like that using neuromorphic? Sometimes they're implemented in hardware even to speed up the process. But as far as are there any techniques that just don't require any training data to get them started, to begin with, in other words? And I thought neuromorphic techniques function that way. They function more like the human brain. I thought that conventional neural networks don't really mimic the human brain as far as the learning process. They're just assigning weights to nodes and all that. And I always wondered, how do they go about determining what function to use that decides how the weights are changed as you propagate forward through the nodes?
Yeah, it's that's an interesting question. I'll have to look into neuromorphic methods. So I guess I'll start off by saying that, you know, with the new generative AI models that are coming out and with all the advancements that have been made in them, we have been looking at creating foundational models, which kind of goes into, you know, modeling, like, I guess the brain would be one way to put it. I mean, it's like a very far-fetched future, but like, you know, if there's one topic that we want to really focus on, like how do we collect as much data as possible? And again, I know this is not what you wanted with regards to saying, you know, what if we don't have training data? But like that is something that's happening with regards to an extension of deep learning that's coming out, which is with generative AI and with the foundation models, where we give it as much data as possible, make the model as large as possible. Obviously, we can't simulate the human brain because it's far too vast and, you know, far too advanced to say that we can, you know, use a deep learning in order to represent it. But what if it's just a subset of knowledge that we're interested in? Like, can we do that? So this is an area that's being looked at, but I think that's very far from what you're talking about. And to kind of address your question a little bit, maybe we have to look at the history, because we say neural networks, they are supposed to be, you know, kind of models of our brain, or at least, you know, the concept of neurons and the firings of, you know, those different nodes and everything that does come from our brain, even though it's not at the scale of where the brain is, or, you know, how that works. So that was supposed to be the origination. I think there are a lot of bumps along the way, and we finally maybe gotten to the place where we can, you know, create those big models, even though they may not be at the scale of the human brain. But with regards to like how do we go about learning for this, and like how do we go about you know, optimizing for it, that's been a topic that's actually been looked at for decades. I mean, deep learning is a new thing, you know, with regards to the big data emergence. That's how deep learning came about. But even before that, there had been a lot of research done on neural networks, and like, you know, how do we go about training them? Like what makes sense? And we ultimately go to the notion in saying they are, you know, universal function approximators due to their nonlinear approximation and all of that. So it's really, you know, cool if you look at it that way. But you know, obviously it's not anywhere near where the human brain is, and I don't think it will get there anytime soon. So yeah, but very cool concept. I think I'll have to look into that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Daniel, I know we're over time, but let's try to get Daniel's question in, and then we'll end for the day. Daniel, if you're there, just go for it. Just unmute yourself and ask. One second, Aastha.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'll just keep it real quick here. So I'm a physiologist. I work in healthcare, and I've been attending the astrobiology science conferences. So the last comments regarding neuromorphic techniques and neural networks, in the astrobiology decadal from the National Academy of Sciences, a comment was made specific to information theory and scaling laws. And so what seems to be happening is that a larger, I mean, it's a real quick comment, not a question, because I don't think other people are addressing it as much. The issue is, are we looking at machine-based learning, or are we looking at biology-based learning? And so when people talk about the model of information communication being a function of the brain or the central nervous system, it's lacking the foundation of systems biology intelligence, that the whole body is a phenomenon of perception and information and measurement. And that's important because when we look at cell structures like protocells and the development of the origin of life, that we have this expansive but very, very simple information model. And so it's important, I believe, for the field to look beyond the brain and look beyond the central nervous system and look to the foundation models of how does information, perception, measurement, communication, etc., happen within simple cell structures, because that's going to give us our idea of how we design machines to replicate biology. Okay, and so that's important. And Caleb, I know you're on the call here. You and I have talked about that briefly at AppSciCon in Providence. And so I just want to share that in terms of a macroeconomic application for designing our machines to reflect biology. A larger, broader, and more simple model of anatomy and physiology would be beneficial.
No, that's fascinating. I personally am very interested in this topic. So now, that I'm exploring the concept of like limitations as well as vulnerabilities, I guess, that the Gen AI models are showing, my brain keeps going back to brain science and being like, okay, what can we learn from the human brain? But the fact that, it may be even beyond that, it's not just the brain, but, the kind of the biological systems and how that impacts it. That's very fascinating.